Good afternoon. I'm very happy to see you. A very warm welcome, particularly to Rashida Manjoo. She is a UN Rapporteur for Violence Against Women, and her 2012 report is on killing of women. Next to her, Antonia Parvanova. She is an MEP from Bulgaria, from the ALDE, the Liberal Group. Thank you very much to have come here. And finally, Raúl Romeva from the Green IFA Group. He is from Catalonia. This morning we had the occasion to have a brilliant presentation of the 2012 report on killing of women. This phenomenon has perhaps first been discovered and coined in the early 90s in Mexico and Ciudad Juarez, where women's groups noted that women were disappearing, appeared dead, were mutilated, tortured, and then on. This phenomenon has been discovered elsewhere and everywhere almost in the world. We have been discussing a lot this phenomenon in Latin America. Do you see some similarities between the situation in Latin America and in Europe?
Thank you very much for having me here. The similarity is that there is a continuum of violence and women are dying. The manifestations are different in terms of how women's bodies are desecrated in some of the Latin American contexts, and I don't see that in Europe. At the same time, in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, the killing of witches, there is sexual violence, killing of women who are accused of being witches, I should correct that. There is sexual violence, there is bodily attacks and abuse, but I do not see the similar manifestation as I see in the Latin American. Having said that, the ultimate consequence is the death of a woman, which is common to countries all over the globe.
The Latin American women have named this phenomenon feminicide, and you say it is the ultimate act of violence, and you say women are constantly in a death row. This feminicide has been taken up by the European Parliament in 2006 with an adoption of a report in 2007 by Raúl Romeva. Catherine Ashton, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, she has also issued a declaration. Is this enough?
Paper is never enough, right? We're just killing trees when we have paper without effective implementation. I think the fact that the European Union has focused on a particular manifestation more than others in the Latin American region is good, because the way it manifested was horrific, the prevalence rates, etc. I think the challenge in terms of terminology, we don't have to get consensus globally about terminology and whether we use feminicide or femicide or gender-related killings. My challenge is that we need to understand the notion, the consequences because of this continuum of violence that women are subjected to, whether in Latin America or in parts of Africa. Is it enough to have guidelines, laws and policies? We need them as a normative framework, because otherwise how do we develop? But the challenge is, how do we do monitoring and implementation, which is a gap in most parts of the world. So identifying a phenomena is a really good start. The political will to have an action plan or a law or a policy on it is good, but the numbers are not going down. And that says there's a gap between what we accept as a phenomena and a growing phenomena and what we're doing about it.
Mrs. Parvanova, Rashida Manjoo has presented her brilliant report this morning in the FEM committee together with the DROIT committee. This means the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality and the Human Rights Committee. Members of the Eurolat Assembly have been also invited. Do you think it is an issue, feminicide is an issue for the European Parliament?
Oh, definitely yes, and especially our committee, the FEM committee, has a long history of struggling with women's rights, discrimination, inequalities and violence against women. Several times we tried to demand from the Commission to come up with legislation which is dedicated towards combating violence against women. We even try to encourage the Commission to support the Member States to ratify and to put into implementation the Council of Europe Convention on Violence Against Women. But when we talk in international terms, not only about the European Union, we have the Foreign Affairs Committee, and especially the subsection of Human Rights, their annual report, which is most of the time mentioning issues of femicide and feminicide. But I think we are ineffective, and I will give some examples. Our Parliament twice has looked at the severe and very cruel killings of women, for example, in Mexico and in Somalia. We try to produce reports, but this attempt of the Parliament to bring to the attention of the Member States and the attention of the Commission for the performance of our international policies, those issues, as a very severe breach of human rights, didn't result in an effective manner. And what I mean, for example, when we have the free trade agreement with Canada and a visa issue for Bulgaria, Romania and Czech Republic, we say that this is unacceptable, and a visa issue is inspiring the parliamentarians to block the free trade agreement with Canada. When we talk about ACA agreement, which is for some industrial goods with Israel, we put again the flotilla 1, 2 and whatever and settlements issue, and we block it. But when we talk about massive and cruel killings in Somalia, there is no effective action. When we talk about Mexico, recently we had the banana and some other agreements with the state of Mexico, but still the issue of female killings was not something that resulted as a breach or stop of the relationships, economic and political, of the Union with those countries. And these are not the only examples that I could mention, but we have to be fair enough. We should not apply double standards, and also to me, if we do not effectively, just on paper, but not effectively support in our policy some measures against feminism, we would expect impunity could be set out, because this is at a very highest political level and international political level kind of attitude that also political negligence is a subject of impunity. And this is what we would like to see sorted out. Otherwise, we are endorsing those regimes which are applying or which are practicing impunity at national level. We are becoming co-participants in this process. And we have to look at something and some measures. Look in what happened in Syria. We apply all the sanctions, even the most severe sanctions, when you talk about massive killings, but for the entire population. When there is a massive killing amounting of about 1 million women in Somalia, we do not apply any sanctions as severe as we apply to Syria. Why there is a double standard? Because it's a matter of killing women and killing general population, or what?
You mentioned impunity as a key factor that fuels into the continuation of the phenomena, and you mentioned sanctions as a possible measure to stop this killing, or at least to sanction certain states. What is the influence of states? What is the responsibility of states in that phenomenon? Is it something between a man and a woman, or is feminicide something that the state has a responsibility on?
It's a state responsibility. The killings of any citizens, it's a state responsibility in terms of their due diligence obligations under international law, under regional human rights law, to prevent, to protect, to punish perpetrators and to provide reparations to victims of violence. It is a state responsibility. The failure of the state in their responsibility to prevent and protect is actually a failure on the part of the state to protect their citizens. And it violates citizenship rights of women when the state's response is ineffective or non-existent.
Are certain women particularly vulnerable? Is the crisis responsible for the phenomenon?
I think women generally are vulnerable, but there are certain categories based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation and gender identity, based on location, geographic location. Do you live in an urban area? Do you live in a rural area? That are particularly vulnerable, not only because there's a lack of accountability and a lack of scrutiny of what goes on in certain parts of a country, but also the lack of services, the lack of access to justice is part of the reality of certain women's lives. And they are particularly migrant women, Roma women in Italy that I saw as well. So I think there are categories of people, and I don't like the term vulnerable because I think that's makes us think about charity and with people that need to be rescued. It's not about rescued, it's about effective citizenship of people. And so based on either your social location, your geographic location, or some bodily integrity aspect, there are certain categories of women that are targeted more than others.
Raul Romeva, you had a landmark report in 2007 on the phenomenon. This morning, the EIS, which is the European Diplomatic Service, has answered to Rashida Manjoo's presentation, and the representative particularly referred to the forthcoming EU Latin American Summit of Heads of States. However, she was not very concrete on what measures should be taken at that occasion. Could you give us an idea of what you think would be necessary to do there?
I think the more important thing that the external services and the states have to understand is that in order to fight against this phenomenon, it has to be visible. I mean, we have to talk about this. It has to be very high in the agendas of the political and mediatic arenas. And that's what the states, the governments, have to understand in the upcoming summit that is going to take place at the Euro-Latin American dimension. This having said, there are concrete steps that we can undertake. One, gathering information, data, providing means in order to have as much as data that we can in order to provide the political responses that we need to. And in that sense, we need not only the complicity of all actors in the field, but also of as many of international organizations as possible. And we need funds for this, let's be clear. I mean, this costs money, but we need to invest, we need to spend money on this. The second, which is to me very important, prevention. And prevention is not only a question of education, which is absolutely crucial, it's more than this. It's fighting impunity is also a way of prevention. Promoting equality is also a way of prevention. Promoting these elements that has to do in order to guarantee the fair trials is also prevention. All this is prevention. If we want to impede these phenomena to occur, we have to invest in information, in fight against impunity, in justice as a fact, and obviously, and that's probably the most important thing, in the structural problems that are provoking that in some contexts this occurs in different manners, but as Rashida said in the beginning, with the same ending, the killing of women. You might differ in context and in different, if you want, internal traditions, but the consequence is exactly the same. And in that sense, if you want to really fight with the consequences of this, you need to understand that the structures, the system is unfair in its roots. And that's what in this action plan should be addressed. If you have places where poverty is basically affecting women, you need to address this. Poverty as a cause of many problems and having as one of the consequences the direct killing of many women. You need to very directly address everything that has to do with these perceptions of or this cultural relativism, saying that in many countries, well, this is a tradition to treat women like this, to do this or to do that. Is it completely unacceptable that we as societies normalize such practices? This having said, is important also to not believe that this is something that is only happening in some countries, in poor countries and underdeveloped countries. That's a very paternalistic approach, which is completely not true. And it happens in different ways, in different parts of the world, and in different contexts, if you want, but it happens everywhere. And that's what we need to understand as a clear focus in order to fight against this phenomenon, which means that in the Latin American relations, we can address this not necessarily by saying you Mexicans or you Guatemalans, you have to do this, but saying we, as a global and universal communities, we have to address this, everyone on its specificities. But we all, as a community, have to take this in the political dimension and with strict, and you were very clear on this as well, proposals. Paper is very good, it's a starting point, it's necessary, but it's not enough. If you do not invest money and political will on the fight against this, nothing is going to change.
Thank you very much. To be very, very concrete, because the EU summit EU, Latin America and Caribbean will take place in January. Raúl talked about the possible action plan, which goes beyond of what heads of state have done until now, which is just declare inside the final declaration that they are worried about the phenomenon. In what context would you embed this action plan? What are the necessary cornerstones so that it is more than the current declarations that have not helped to curb the phenomenon, but to make it a bit more visible, but this was not enough? What would you add as an added value?
I mean, it's not a new notion that globally we all want to focus on gender, but what we're missing is a specificity. And if we don't recognize that violence against women is a cause and a consequence of inequality and discrimination, then we're doing a disservice. So we need to render it, as Raúl has said, we need to make it visible that it's not about charity, it's not a social issue, it's not a cultural issue. So in any plan or policy, if there's no recognition, if we talk about gender mainstreaming without recognizing that violence against women is a cause and a consequence of inequality and discrimination, then we're not even going to get off the starting blocks. So for me, that's fundamental. There needs to be mainstreaming, there needs to be a gender focus, but there needs to be specificity in terms of what is it that violates and diminishes women's rights to equality and non-discrimination, and violence does that globally. And so that needs to be clear-cut. It wasn't clear-cut in the MDGs. I'm hoping that the post-2015 agenda picks up on the fact that when we don't articulate with specificity that violence against women is a cause and a consequence of inequality and discrimination, then we're failing women. Because just talking about mainstreaming gender means that we're talking the rhetoric that we all know, but we're not dealing with the specificities of the inability to attain substantive equality and non-discrimination.
Mrs. Parvanova, what sort of monitoring could EU legislators do in this context presented here?
I think first of all for European legislators, and not only legislators, all political, the highest political level in our EU institutions, needs a little bit to reconsider the priorities that we put in these international talks, summits, and in our work as well. Because if you look at the facts, for about 2 years, the Parliament is demanding from the Commission to come up either with legislation combating violence against women or to come up with a strategy for 2 years. And if we are not able to reconsider our own priorities, if we do not put in order our own house and our own thoughts, how we are going to communicate with others that it is a priority in our international policy, in the funds that we dedicate for international development and regional development, in our total communication with international politicians, how are we going to put as a priority, as part of the human rights, also the women's rights, and especially protecting women from historically anchored already practices violence to the severest extent, which is killing of women. So in this regard, probably we have to monitor our standards and our priorities, and then based on the evidence about the trends of violence, and especially taking into account the crisis. What were the trends of violence in the member states and in the world, in our partnering countries, and what they are during the crisis? Probably then, in an evidence-based way, we will face the truth. Is it deteriorating? Is it getting better or worse? In which countries is it getting better or worse? For what reasons? And is it only the legislation and the political commitment or something else? How the development of the society actually is shaped around the reconsidering of priorities during crisis. What is it true that we started the austerity measures with the social package, with the healthcare package? Did we reach also the extent when we are breaching or we are interfering with the human rights package? And who is the first in the human rights package? Is it true? Do we have an evidence that we started with the women's rights in this package? Do our austerity measures actually influence the women's rights? This is something that in the monitoring process should, in evidence-based way, should be presented to the decision makers, and probably by having this data and being able to analyze, we will be able to put our policies and priorities in the right order.
So data, monitoring and elimination of double standards is crucial for getting forward.
Setting up priorities which are evidence-based.
Yes,
To that, because I think one of the things that came through very clearly for me during my Italian mission was with the cutbacks, with the fiscal cutbacks, it was impacting shelters, services, etc. for battered women, which means, of course, with the continuum of violence, it can lead to the deaths. But what wasn't on the radar, and it was worrying, that once services shut down, it's not only deprivation to the victim, but it's a loss of expertise to that country. And it costs more to develop that expertise when the financial crisis is over. And so in my report to the government, I talk about the fact that you're losing a whole lot of expertise because of these cutbacks and the closing down of shelters, of women's rights organizations, etc. And it's going to cost you far more to reset these things up. And so I think that loss of expertise needs to be factored into all decisions when fiscal cutbacks are being discussed.
Yes.
That's very important also for other countries.
Yeah. Perhaps as we are finishing our meeting, let us focus again on Latin America and the summit ahead. Latin America in a certain way seems to be at the forefront because they had the declaration of Belén do Pará on violence against women, which was already adopted in '93, if I'm not mistaken. And recently in 2010 we have the ruling of the Inter-American Court of Justice of Human Rights in the famous cotton fields case against the Mexican state. So everybody is applauding this ruling. However, the Mexican state does not implement the recommendations. What should the EU do?
Well, actually, the funny thing, obviously, ironically, with the Mexicans is that this is a topic that is up and down depending on the international pressure. When there is a sort of international pressure, something happens. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's less better, but something happens. You have a law, you have a reaction from the government, you have a reaction from the governor of the state of Juarez or wherever. Something happens. The problem is that the European Union has to understand, in order that this to happen, the topic has to be in all the bilateral dialogues. It's not enough that we speak about this one day and then after 3 years we simply forget because something is being done there. That's a completely mistake. And that's what I ask the external services, but also the capitals and the European Union and the European Parliament and the Commission to keep this into their agendas in every bilateral meeting they have, not only with Mexico, with the Central American countries, with everybody that is having this type of situations. Because that's proven, it's the only way that we can see some improvements there. The second aspect that is important as well. Well, Mexico is a very singular case. It shouldn't be said that it's the worst in the world. I mean it's very. This is relative, if you want. On the positive side, Mexico has the positive thing to have been leading the conceptual debate, which is something important. I mean, I have to give credit to those people in Mexico that have started thinking, trying to theoretically define the concept. Feminicides in Guatemala, the femicides, whatever you want to call them, but they are starting to have this into the intellectual arena, which is something that is important, and we have to credit those countries for this. The political response is a completely different story. And several times we have heard from Mexican authorities saying that, well, we have a bigger and more important problem there, which is the narco traffic. And because of this, we cannot focus on other aspects that are kind of minor issues like the killing of women. Well, that's completely, I'm sorry to say, but it's a lie. I mean, first, both things are usually linked and very much linked. Second, if you want to tackle the real roots, the causes of the two problems are most of the time the same. Inequality and injustice, impunity, lack of capacity for the tribunals, from the justice services, corruptions. This is what we need to tackle. And this is a problem fighting the narco traffic, and this is a problem fighting the killings of women. So in that sense, if we don't understand the roots and the causes of those phenomena, we are not going to be able to fight them. So that's what the European authorities need to put all the debates with Mexicans, with Guatemalans, with Honduras, with El Salvador, and obviously with other countries. I mean, you mentioned those in Asia, which are absolutely also singular in their characteristics and their patterns. But still, the problem, as you said in the beginning, is the same.
Yeah, as you said in the beginning, the problem is not social, it's not cultural, it's a problem of human rights. We have to go ahead with that. We have to fight against it. We have to eliminate double standards. We have to monitor and to create data and to put money to it so that experience don't get lost. It was wonderful to have you here today, to have exposed your latest report, which is called, I spell it out, Report of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, its Causes and Consequences. It is a 2012 report by UN. What will be your next report?
The issue of state responsibility and how states interpret and implement their due diligence obligations in terms of protection, prevention, punishment and redress.
By when?
2030.
The report it'll be tabled in June next year. Yeah.
Well, I think we are all looking forward to that report, and I hope we can see you again and continue our discussion with figures having gone down before. Thank you very much.
Thank you.